Most people associate the Korean War with brutal trench battles, rapid advances, and the painful stalemate along the 38th parallel. But what is rarely discussed is how extreme cold, especially during the winter of 1950 to 51, affected soldiers' ability to fight and survive. Freezing temperatures in the Chosin Reservoir region claimed thousands of lives, not only through combat but through hypothermia, frostbite, and honestly just inadequate shelter. Supply lines struggled to provide winter clothing and heating materials, forcing units to improvise with whatever insulation they could find. This crisis highlighted a long-standing problem in warfare. Understanding and controlling one's environment can be as critical as controlling the battlefield itself. If you value detailed historical analysis that examines both strategy and survival, consider subscribing now, because the story of environmental mastery and its overlooked lessons runs much deeper than standard war narratives. The Vikings, centuries earlier, faced a similar challenge on the cold coasts and fjords of northern Europe. They survived winters that routinely pushed human endurance to the limit. Yet their solutions to insulation were not crude. They were sophisticated, resourceful, and in some respects even more effective than modern synthetic foam. Vikings relied on moss and layered natural materials to create insulation that kept interiors warm and, soundproof. Archaeological excavations of Viking longhouses in Norway and Denmark have uncovered layers of sphagnum moss packed between timber walls, under floors, and even in roofs. Moss was not used haphazardly. Sphagnum retains water while maintaining structural integrity, providing both thermal insulation and moisture regulation. In damp, cold climates, a wall without this padding could leak heat, swell with moisture, or crack under seasonal pressure. Moss-filled walls created microclimates within longhouses, trapping warmth while preventing drafts that could render an entire shelter uninhabitable. In a way, this was an early form of passive technology. Unlike modern foam insulation, which relies on trapped air within synthetic matrices, moss adjusts naturally to humidity and compresses under pressure, maintaining thermal efficiency without chemical additives. For survival-minded viewers, the lesson is clear. Understanding local materials and their properties often yields solutions superior to off-the-shelf technology, especially in austere conditions. The effectiveness of Viking insulation extended beyond simple warmth. Insulated walls also controlled sound and, by extension, human and animal perception. Vikings were aware that stealth mattered in both settlement defense and tactical maneuvers. Timber structures without moss could creak, groan, or amplify movement. Moss-filled gaps dampened these noises, creating quiet interiors that reduced the risk of surprise detection by humans or predators. Collecting and preparing moss required careful attention and long-term planning. Vikings didn't simply gather any available moss. Sphagnum from bogs was preferred for its resilience, while cushion mosses from shaded forests provided elasticity for walls and floors. Moss was harvested during specific seasons to ensure it retained moisture and durability. Once collected, it was dried and compressed into panels or stuffed between timber joints. This labor-intensive preparation, really mirrors modern supply chain planning. Careful resource selection, processing, and storage were critical to achieving functional results. The parallels to the Korean War are striking. Soldiers in the Chosin Reservoir often improvised insulation from rags, branches, or whatever natural materials were at hand. The difference is that Vikings had institutionalized this knowledge over generations. Survival in both cases depended less on courage alone than on environmental understanding, resource allocation, and the foresight to prepare well before the crisis arrived. Viking insulation also had implications for structural longevity and health. So thermal regulation alone is important, but moisture control was equally critical in wooden structures. Untreated timber in damp climates can rot quickly, compromise load-bearing capacity, and, even harbor mold. The moss-filled walls acted as a buffer, absorbing excess moisture while still allowing the timber to breathe. This actually prevented decay while maintaining interior warmth. Now, modern foam insulation, while it's effective in trapping heat, can, if not properly ventilated, trap condensation against timber surfaces and accelerate rot. The Vikings solved this problem with a material that naturally managed moisture, creating healthier, longer-lasting living spaces without relying on any industrial technology. This knowledge really highlights an important principle. Resilience in human settlements is often a product of observation, experimentation, and adaptation over time. The Vikings' choice of insulation wasn't just instinctual, it was actually iterative. Builders learned which mosses performed best, how thick to layer them, and where to place them for maximum benefit. Today, we might describe this approach as evidence-based environmental engineering, something the Vikings were applying centuries before formal engineering principles were even codified. There is a tactical lesson in Viking insulation for modern military history and, survival scenarios. Winter warfare is not simply a question of clothing or firepower. Environmental mastery, you see, determines mobility, endurance, and overall effectiveness. In Korea, for example, units exposed to extreme cold suffered reduced operational capacity, slower reaction times, and, higher attrition. The Vikings achieved an analogous advantage. Insulated longhouses allowed them to store provisions safely, recover from cold exposure more quickly, and plan operations without the debilitating effects of hypothermia. The same principles apply today to survivalists operating in extreme conditions. Small investments in environmental adaptation, like insulation, shelter, and moisture management, yield disproportionately high returns in performance and safety. The continuity of these practices is visible in later Northern European architecture. Medieval builders often continued the use of moss straw and layered organic materials in timber constructions. Acoustic and thermal insulation were considered essential for both castles and rural homesteads. In essence, Viking methods were observed, tested, and codified into architectural traditions that lasted for centuries. They really demonstrate the value of incremental knowledge transfer. A practice developed for survival in a harsh climate becomes integrated into culture, technology, and even military planning. Studying these forgotten practices really enriches our understanding of historical warfare. Vikings are often remembered as raiders and seafarers, but their innovations in living conditions, insulation, and environmental control reveal a different dimension. Strategic thinking applied to survival and settlement. These stories show that human ingenuity is rarely about one dramatic act. It is about cumulative problem-solving, attention to detail, and understanding the consequences of every decision in context. For viewers interested in both history and practical survival, these lessons are timeless. They remind us that the effectiveness of any strategy, whether raiding a settlement, enduring winter warfare, or simply surviving in the wild, depends on preparation, resourcefulness, and the thoughtful use of available materials. In some cases, natural solutions outperform modern technology, not through sophistication, but through adaptability and intimate knowledge of the environment. Remembering these forgotten methods changes how we think about history and human resilience. The Vikings' moss insulation is not merely a curiosity, it is evidence of a mindset that valued foresight, efficiency, and ecological literacy. Understanding these techniques expands our view of the past, revealing that the challenges of cold, damp, and resource scarcity were met with careful, practical solutions that often outperformed modern substitutes. Historical analysis, when it includes these overlooked aspects, deepens both our technical understanding and our appreciation for human ingenuity. If this exploration of Viking insulation has offered new insight into survival, architecture, and historical problem solving, subscribe to History Vmaters for more in-depth analysis of overlooked historical innovations. Share this video with others who value thoughtful, research-based storytelling and keep the lessons of the past alive for both study and practical application today.